The stagecoach wheel cracked clean through on the last stretch of road before Dry Creek, and Margaret Hadley decided then and there that the territory of Wyoming in the year 1882 had made up its mind to kill her. She stood on the side of the dusty trail with her single leather traveling bag, her blue wool dress already caked with the fine red dust that seemed to exist nowhere else in the world but here, and she watched the driver, a thick-necked man named Dooley, who smelled of tobacco and misfortune, scratch the back of his head and announce that the next coach through this particular stretch would not arrive until Tuesday. It was Saturday afternoon. The sun was already bleeding orange across the flat horizon, and the wind that swept in from the northwest carried a cold edge that promised a hard night. There were two other passengers, a traveling salesman named Mr. Clifton who had pale hands and a nervous disposition, and an elderly woman named Mrs. Prout who was heading to see her daughter in Cheyenne. Both of them looked at Margaret with the particular expression of people who expected her to panic, and she supposed she understood why. She was 26 years old, she had traveled alone from Missouri, and she had the kind of soft brown eyes and careful posture that made strangers assume she was fragile. She was not fragile. She had simply learned long ago that looking harmless was a kind of armor. Mr. Clifton declared he would remain with the coach and the driver. Mrs. Prout began to weep quietly into a handkerchief. Margaret picked up her bag, looked north along the trail where a thin finger of smoke rose against the failing sky, and started walking. She heard the salesman call after her that it was not safe. She did not stop. The smoke came from a small homestead about a mile north of the road, a low structure of rough timber with a lean-to stable beside it, and a corral fence that had seen better decades. There was a horse in the corral, a big roan with a blaze down his face, and the horse watched her approach with far more interest than the man who stood at the fence rail watching her did. That man was Hugh Brooks. He was somewhere in his early 30s, lean but broad in the shoulder, with dark hair that needed cutting and jaw that needed a razor, and he had the kind of stillness about him that Margaret had only seen before in men who had spent serious time alone. He wore a worn canvas coat over a work shirt, and his hands rested on the top rail of the fence, in the manner of someone who had not yet decided whether to be hospitable or to send her away. He watched her walk the last 50 yards to his fence without moving a single muscle. Margaret stopped at the gate and looked at him. "My coach lost a wheel back on the road," she said. "The driver says the next one through is Tuesday. I need shelter for the night, possibly 2 nights. I can pay a fair price for the room and for a meal." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her at the trail, as if verifying her story by the absence of anyone following her. Then he looked back at her face. "Where you headed?" he asked. His voice was low and unhurried, the way voices got when a person spent most of their days talking only to horses. "Dry Creek," she said. "I have a teaching position waiting for me. The school term starts Monday week." He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected, though she could not imagine what. "I only have the one room," he said, "and the one bed." He said it plainly, without apology and without any particular suggestion in it. He said it the way a man states a fact about the weather. "Here is the situation. Here is what is true, and you may do with that information what you will." Margaret looked at the cabin behind him. She looked at the way the temperature was dropping as the last light left the sky. She thought about a night on the open prairie in a broken stagecoach. She thought about the 2 years she had spent in a boarding house in St. Louis where she shared a room with 3 other women and a persistent draft, and the winter before that when her father's house had burned, and she had slept in a neighbor's barn for 6 nights with nothing but a horse blanket. "I have slept in worse," she said, and walked through the gate. Something shifted in his expression then. It was brief, and she might have imagined it, a flicker of something that looked almost like surprise, or perhaps something closer to appreciation for a woman who did not make things complicated. He turned and walked toward the cabin without another word, and she followed him inside. The interior was clean in the way that only deeply private people keep things clean, not for appearances, but out of a personal relationship with order. There was a cast iron stove that was doing an admirable job against the chill, a small table with 2 chairs, shelves with canned goods and tools and a few books, a wash basin and a trunk, and against the far wall, the single bed with a wool blanket folded at its foot. A lantern burned on the table, throwing warm amber light across everything. Hugh Brooks hung his coat on a peg near the door and moved to the stove to add wood without being asked. "I can make coffee," he said, "and there is salt pork and beans." "That sounds fine," Margaret said. She set her bag down near the door and unbuttoned her traveling coat and looked around the room with the practical eye of someone cataloging resources. "I can cook if you would prefer." He glanced at her over his shoulder. "I know how to cook." "I did not say you didn't," she replied. That silence stretched between them for a moment, and then, very quietly, he made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was suppressed quickly, but it was there, and it changed the quality of the air in the room in a way that Margaret found unexpectedly pleasant. She sat down at the table. He cooked. The beans were good, seasoned with something she could not identify, but that tasted like dried sage and black pepper, and the coffee was strong and dark and wonderful after the long cold day. They ate across from each other in the lamplight, and she told him about Missouri and the teaching position in Dry Creek, and he listened with the kind of attention that was rarer than she had realized until she had spent enough time around men who only listened to decide when it was their turn to speak. Hugh Brooks listened because he was actually interested. She could tell the difference. He told her his name when she asked. He told her the land was his, bought from a man named Coogan 3 years prior who had gotten tired of the territory and gone south. He ran cattle, not many, but enough. He mentioned without elaborating, took on occasional work for the county when the county had work to offer, which she understood to be something in the nature of a lawman's assistant, though he did not say it in those words. "Do you get many travelers coming through?" she asked. "Not many who knock," he said. She looked at him across the table. "Did you expect me to knock?" "I expected you to keep walking," he said. "I might have," she said honestly, "but the smoke was inviting." Turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pressing against the cabin walls with a low, steady sound. The lantern flame bent slightly, though the cabin was well sealed. "You can have the bed," he said when they had finished eating. "I will take the floor." Margaret looked at the floor. It was packed earth, cold even through the boards that covered most of it, and the temperature had dropped further in the last hour. "That is very gallant of you," she said, "and also unnecessary. The bed looks wide enough for 2 adults who are capable of minding their own business, and the floor will be genuinely cold by midnight." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that careful, measuring look that was not suspicion exactly, but rather the look of a man recalibrating his assumptions about a person. "I would not want you to be uncomfortable," he said, very carefully. "I would be significantly more uncomfortable knowing you were freezing on the floor out of a sense of propriety neither of us actually requires," she said. "I am a grown woman, Mr. Brooks. You have been nothing but decent since I walked through your gate. We can sleep in the same bed without it meaning anything that we do not choose for it to mean." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." And that was the end of that discussion. They slept on opposite sides of the bed with the wool blanket between them and the cold pressing in from every direction. And Margaret, who had not slept peacefully in longer than she cared to admit, found that the low sound of the wind and the steady warmth of another person nearby made something in her chest loosen very slowly, like a fist unclenching. She was asleep within minutes. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of something sizzling on the stove, and the gray pre-dawn light coming through the single window of the cabin. Hugh Brooks was already dressed and had his back to her, working at the stove with the economical movements of a man who had done this sequence of actions 10,000 times. Margaret lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling. She had not expected this. She had not expected any of this: the forced stop, the unexpected shelter, the strange and specific comfort of this plain room with its single lamp and its serious, quiet occupant. She had expected Tuesday and misery and the cold seat of a broken stagecoach. She sat up and smoothed her dress as best she could and went to wash her face at the basin. He had made eggs. She had not seen any chickens, but there was, she supposed, a henhouse on the other side of the stable and more of the strong coffee, and cornbread that was slightly charred on the bottom in the way that suggested a man who was confident in his cooking but occasionally distracted by other things. "You have chickens," she observed. "6 of them," he said. "They are not sociable animals." "Neither are most people I've met in the territory," she replied. He looked up at her. In the morning light she noticed his eyes for the first time properly. They were a dark gray-green, the color of the river on an overcast day, and they had a directness to them that she found she did not mind at all. Sunday stretched before them. The stage was not coming until Tuesday. The wind was still high outside, and the sky had gone the color of pewter, suggesting that going anywhere on foot was not a sensible plan. Margaret had not survived to 26 by sitting still when there were things to be done. So after breakfast she asked him, without preamble, what needed doing around the homestead. He looked at her the way people often did when she said something they hadn't anticipated, and then he told her the fence on the east side of the corral had a section that needed mending, and there was wood to split, and the henhouse roof had developed a gap that he had been meaning to address. She told him she had done fence work before and could help with that, and that she was sorry but she did not know roofing. He said that was fine and handed her a pair of thick work gloves from the shelf near the door. They worked outside in the gray, cold morning, and she learned things about Hugh Brooks in the way you learn things about people when you are working beside them rather than talking at them. He was patient with the fence post that would not seat properly, working it again and again without frustration. He knew where every tool was without looking. He did not give unnecessary instruction. He showed her how he wanted the wire wrapped once, and then assumed she had understood, which she had. When she struggled with a particularly stubborn section of wire, he came over and worked it loose without making it into a demonstration of her weakness or his strength. He simply helped and then stepped back. They ate midday with cold cornbread and the last of the beans, and he opened a tin of peaches that he seemed to have been saving for something, setting the tin on the table between them with no explanation. "I like peaches," she said. "So do I," he said. "That is the last tin." "Then we are sharing a luxury," she said. He almost smiled. She had noticed that about him he held his smiles carefully, like a man who had learned to be sparing with things of value. In the afternoon the sky made good on its promise, and snow began to fall. It was not a blizzard, but it was steady and purposeful, the sort of snow that had decided it was going to accumulate. Margaret stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched it come down over the brown grass and the dark fence posts and the roan in the corral, who stood with his back to the weather with the philosophical air of an animal that had been through worse. "What is his name?" she asked, tilting her head toward the horse. Hugh came to stand behind her in the doorway. "Copper," he said. "He looks entirely unbothered by the snow." "He was born in Montana," Hugh said, as if this explained it completely, which she supposed it did. The snow kept them inside for the rest of the afternoon. Margaret, who had packed for a teaching position and not for a weekend in a one-room cabin, had exactly one book in her bag, a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson that she had been working through for the past month. She noticed that Hugh had books on his shelf, and she looked at them while he worked at sharpening tools near the stove, and she was surprised by what she found there. He had a battered copy of Darwin's recent work, a water-stained volume of Shakespeare's histories, a geography of the Western Territories, and 3 agricultural manuals that showed heavy use. It was not the shelf of an uneducated man. "You have read Shakespeare," she said. "I have," he said without looking up from the blade. "Henry V," she said, reading the spine. Specifically, he agreed. "Why Henry V?" He considered this for a moment, drawing the blade along the whetstone. "He did not ask his men to do anything he would not do himself," Hugh said. "I have always thought that was the mark of a decent man." Margaret turned from the shelf and looked at him. He was still focused on the blade, his hands moving with the steady rhythm of the task. "That is a very good reason," she said quietly. He glanced up then and found her looking at him, and something happened in that moment. One of those small, charged silences where the air between two people becomes aware of itself. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, maybe 4, before looking back down at the blade. But the quality of the room had shifted again, and this time it did not shift back. She spent the evening reading her Emerson at the table while he mended something leather at the other end of the table. And they talked, not constantly, but comfortably, in the way of people who had arrived at ease with each other in the space of less than a day. She told him about growing up in Jefferson City, about her father, the schoolteacher who had died 3 years ago and left her with his library and his love of learning and not much else. She told him about the decision to come west, the way she had looked at the map and chosen Dry Creek the way other people chose anything in those days out of hope and necessity, and the particular courage of having no better option. He told her about Ohio, where he had grown up on a farm. About the war which had been fought when he was a boy, but whose shadow had stretched long enough to reach his older brothers, one of whom had not come home. He said very little about the years between Ohio and Wyoming, and she did not press him on it, but she understood from the way he talked around those years that they had contained things he was still making peace with. The second night was not like the first night. They were not strangers anymore, not entirely, and the easy proximity that had been practicality the night before had become something else, something warmer and more deliberate, and they both felt it and neither of them said a word about it. Margaret lay in the dark listening to the snow fall in silence outside the cabin walls and to the slow, even sound of Hugh's breathing beside her, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had not felt this unalone in years. She wondered if he was awake. She suspected he was, but they lay still and said nothing, and eventually the warmth and the quiet took her under again. Monday brought sun, and the snow glittered so fiercely on the ground that it was almost painful to look at. The world had been made clean and white overnight, and the air was sharp and cold and brilliant. Margaret woke to find Hugh already outside, tending to Copper and the cattle. She could see him through the window, moving between the dark shapes of the animals in the white morning, and she stood there in her dress watching him work for a moment longer than she needed to. She made the coffee. She had found that she knew where everything was now, after 2 days, and it felt natural to move around the space without asking. She heard him come in, heard the door, heard his boots on the floor, and she turned and handed him a cup. He took it and looked at her. "You made coffee," he said. "You made it the last 2 mornings," she said. "It seemed fair." He drank it and she watched his expression change in the way of someone tasting something genuinely good. "You make better coffee than I do," he said. "My father used to say that coffee was the only thing in the world worth doing correctly," she said. Hugh looked into his cup. "He sounds like a man worth knowing." "He was," she said, and she meant it simply, without the grief weighing it down, because enough time had passed that she could say it that way. After breakfast, she washed the dishes and he went back out to check on the cattle, and she sat at the table and tried to prepare herself mentally for arriving in Dry Creek. She had a position. She had a place to board with a family named the Holloways, friends of the Reverend who had arranged her placement. She had a classroom of children waiting for her Monday week. She had a whole life arranged and waiting in a town she had never seen, and she had been entirely prepared for it, eager for it, even until 2 days ago, when a wagon wheel had broken, and the arithmetic of her future had been disrupted by a man with gray-green eyes who kept peaches like a treasure and read Henry V. She was still sitting at the table with these thoughts when Hugh came back inside and knocked the snow from his boots and stood in the middle of the room looking at her with the expression she had come to think of as his honest expression, the one where he was thinking something true and deciding whether to say it. "The road will be passable today," he said. "I could drive you into Dry Creek in the wagon. It is only 8 miles. She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. "All right," she said, "but I want to say something first." He waited. "I want to thank you," she said, "not just for the shelter." For being, she paused, searching for the right word. Decent, she settled on, which was the same word she had thought of last night in the dark. You have been genuinely decent, and I do not always encounter that, and I want you to know that it has been noticed and appreciated. He stood very still in the middle of the room. His hat was in his hands and he was turning it slowly, and she could see that he was working at what to say in the same careful way he worked at everything. It is not a difficult thing, he said finally, to be decent to a person who deserves it. That sentence hit her somewhere in the chest with the weight of an unexpected thing. I hope you will come into town sometime, she said. Dry Creek, I mean. I will be teaching there. I come in for supplies, he said, from time to time. Good, she said, and she left it there. The drive to Dry Creek took an hour and a half in the wagon, through the brilliant snow-covered landscape that looked like something painted by a person who had wanted to make a point about beauty. Hugh drove and Margaret sat beside him on the bench seat, and they talked and sometimes were quiet, and the talking and the quiet were both equally easy, which was the rarest kind of conversation. She learned that he had been in Dry Creek before, but not recently. She learned that he knew of the Holloways, good people, he said simply, and that the school had been without a proper teacher for 2 years, the last one having gone back east in the spring. They will be glad of you, he said. Do you know that, or are you being kind? She asked. Both, he said, and that was the closest thing to a compliment he had given her directly, and it landed with more weight than any elaborate compliment she had ever received. Dry Creek turned out to be a town of perhaps 400 people, with a main street of false-fronted buildings and a proper church, and a livery stable, and a general store and 2 saloons, which seemed like one more than the town strictly needed, but which she supposed said something true about the nature of frontier settlements. People looked at the wagon when it came in, as people always looked at wagons in small towns, and she felt their eyes assessing her and making decisions she would spend the next weeks either confirming or overturning. Hugh helped her down from the wagon in front of the general store where she had been told to present herself on arrival, and held her bag while she straightened her coat and pulled the dust from her sleeves. Thank you, she said, for everything. Yes, he said. He handed her the bag. Their fingers touched briefly on the handle, and neither of them moved for just a half-second longer than necessary. He climbed back up to the wagon seat. She looked up at him. Mr. Brooks, she said. Hugh. He looked down at her. Come in for supplies soon, she said. He held her gaze. Then he clicked to the horse and turned the wagon, and she watched him go, and something in her chest was already working at the math of how long a person might wait before a reasonable excuse to see someone again might present itself. She had been in Dry Creek exactly 4 days when she saw him again. She was coming out of the general store on a Thursday afternoon with a parcel of supplies for the boarding house Mrs. Holloway had sent her for flour, and a spool of white thread, and a tin of baking powder. And she turned on the step, and there he was, on the other side of the street, tying copper to the hitching rail outside Garner's Feed and Grain. He had not seen her yet. She stood for a moment watching him untie the knot he had already tied, because it was not, apparently, to his satisfaction. And something about that, about the care of it, the small private insistence on doing it right even when no one was watching, made her step off the porch and cross the street. He looked up when she was 10 feet away, and the thing that crossed his face was not quite a smile but was something better, a sudden openness, like a window being raised. Miss Hadley, he said. Mr. Brooks, she said. The not giving you trouble. He looked at the hitching rail and then back at her with the dry expression of a man who knew when he was being teased. He gets ideas, he said, gesturing at Copper, who was looking at her with his ears forward and an expression of intense interest. If the knot is not right, he talks himself into believing he can undo it. He sounds resourceful, she said. He is a nuisance, said Hugh fondly, and reached out to scratch behind the horse's ear in a gesture that was entirely at odds with his words. She stood with him while he went into Garner's, and because it was the most natural thing in the world, she went in with him and looked at the barrels of grain and the coils of rope and the hardware while he gave his order to the man behind the counter. And they talked the way they had talked in the wagon, easily and honestly. And she told him about the school, about the 14 children ranging from 6 to 15 years old who were going to be her students starting next week. And about the schoolroom itself, which had a broken window she had already reported to the town council. He nodded at the broken window with the expression of someone making a note. "You should come and see the school," she said. He looked at her sideways. "What for?" "Because I am inviting you," she said, "and because you might be the sort of man who knows how to fix a window." That was how it started, officially with a broken window and an invitation, and the particular electricity of two people choosing each other repeatedly in small ways, until the choosing becomes something neither of them can imagine not doing. Hugh came to the school the following Saturday morning with a piece of glass and the tools to set it, and she showed him the classroom with its rows of rough wooden desks, and the blackboard that needed a new coat of paint, and the bookshelf that she had already begun to fill with what she had brought from Missouri, and what she had found, surprisingly, in the back room of the general store, which the owner, Mr. Patterson, had been using to store a crate of donated books for 2 years without knowing what to do with them. Hugh fixed the window while she arranged books, and they talked about education and the territory, and what children needed to learn to be useful citizens of a place that was still figuring out what kind of place it wanted to be. He had opinions she had not expected, thoughtful ones, about the importance of practical knowledge alongside book learning, about the children of the ranching families who needed to understand numbers and letters not as abstractions, but as tools for running land and keeping accounts and writing letters to the people they loved when distance separated them. She stopped arranging books and looked at him. "You sound like my father," she said. He said almost exactly that. Hugh looked up from the window frame. "What was his name?" "Robert," she said. "Robert Hadley. He taught school in Jefferson City for 22 years. "He did good work then," Hugh said. "He would have liked you," she said, and then felt the color come into her face because it was an honest thing, and honest things had a way of landing harder than she intended. He was quiet for a moment, setting the glass into the frame with precise, careful hands. "I am glad of that," he said quietly. They ate lunch at the small restaurant on the main street, the only restaurant in Dry Creek, run by a wide, cheerful woman named Me who called everyone honey, without exception, and made pie that Margaret was already convinced was the best she had ever eaten. Hugh sat across from her in the small booth, and they had beef stew and Me's cornbread and coffee, and it felt so entirely natural and so entirely right that Margaret had a passing moment of panic about it, because the last time something had felt this natural and this right she had been 22, and the man in question had ridden away to Texas and not come back. She had not talked about that. She did not particularly want to talk about it now. But she was 26 and a schoolteacher in a frontier town, and she had slept in a stranger's bed because she had slept in worse, and she was not going to let old fear do the work of current reason. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Have you ever been married?" He looked at her steadily without flinching. "No," he said. "I came close once, 7 years ago." She went back east. I did not blame her. It is a hard life out here, and it was harder then. "Did it take you a long time to get over it?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. "Did I need to get over it?" "It was more that I had to." He paused, turning his coffee cup. "I had to stop waiting for things to be different and just let them be what they were." She nodded slowly. She understood that exactly. She had done the same thing at 23, and it had taken the better part of a year and a great deal of her father's Emerson. "I was engaged once," she said. "He decided Texas suited him better than commitment." Hugh looked at her. "His loss," he said, simply and completely. She looked at him across the table in the warm, small restaurant with the smell of Me's pie in the air, and the main street of Dry Creek visible through the window and the whole territory spread out beyond it. And she thought that this, whatever this was the thing she had been traveling toward all along, even though she had thought she was just traveling to a teaching job. The school term began on Monday, and Margaret threw herself into it with the complete dedication she gave to everything that mattered to her. She had 14 students and 14 different sets of challenges, and she cataloged them quickly. Eli Turner was 12 and sharp as a tack, but convinced that learning was something that happened to other people. Sarah Prescott was 9 and read beautifully, but had never been taught her sums. The Morales brothers, Tomás and Louis, were 10 and 8 and had been in the territory only a year, their family having come up from New Mexico, and they were still finding their footing in English, which Margaret addressed by learning a handful of useful Spanish phrases from Tomás in exchange for extra reading instruction. She enjoyed the children deeply. She enjoyed the work. And she enjoyed, on the Saturdays when Hugh drove in for one thing or another, the walk to Me's restaurant or the conversation in the school room or the slow circling of two people arriving at something true. He asked her one Saturday in March if she would like to ride out to see the ranch. She said yes before he had finished asking. She rode Copper, Hugh rode a younger horse, a gray he called Slate, and they went across the spring prairie that was beginning to green after the long brown winter, and the sky was the deep clear blue that existed, Margaret was increasingly convinced, only in Wyoming. She saw the cabin again with fresh eyes. She had thought of it so many times in the months since that night that it had taken on a kind of mythic quality in her mind, and seeing it plainly in the daylight was both smaller and better than the myth. It was a plain cabin. It was solid and well kept, and it had a view of the mountains on clear days that was simply extraordinary. She stood by the corral fence and looked at those mountains for a long time. "It is a good piece of land," she said. "It is," he said beside her. "I thought so when I first saw it, and I have not changed my mind." She looked at him sideways. "What do you like best about it?" He thought about it. "The quiet," he said. "Not silent, the wind, the animals, the weather, but not crowded. There is room to think here." She understood that. She had grown up in a city, relatively speaking, but she had always done her best thinking outdoors, away from walls. "And what do you like least?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a care that told her he was saying something true rather than something easy, that there is no one to share it with. She held very still. Beside her, Hugh was looking at the mountains, his hands on the fence rail, and his profile in the afternoon light was serious and earnest and entirely unguarded, and she realized that he had just told her something that had cost him something, and that he had told her because he trusted her with it. "Hugh," she said. He turned to look at her. "I would like to share it," she said, "if you are asking." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched that careful, sparing expression of his rearrange itself into something open and warm and certain, and it was like watching a door come open. "I am asking," he said. He reached out and took her hand from the fence rail and held it in both of his, and she turned her palm up and laced her fingers with his. And they stood like that in the April sunlight with the mountains ahead of them and the green coming up through the brown grass, and Copper watching them with his ears forward, and a look of complete approval on his long face. He kissed her for the first time standing at that fence, a careful and unhurried kiss that tasted like coffee and honesty, and she kissed him back with all the directness that was the best thing about her. And when they stepped apart, his gray-green eyes were the warmest she had ever seen them. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed, and she was smiling in a way that she could feel reaching her eyes and her whole face and probably, she suspected, her whole body. He proposed to her in May. He did not do it dramatically. He did not do it in front of an audience. He came to the school on a Friday evening, just as she was finishing for the week, and he stood in the doorway of the schoolroom and waited until she had finished erasing the board and turned around and found him there. He was holding his hat in his hands and turning it again the way he always did when he was working at something important, and she looked at him and felt her heart rise in her chest like a bird. "Margaret," he said. "Hugh," she said. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "I have thought about it carefully, and I believe we would suit each other very well. I believe you are the finest person I have met in this territory and possibly anywhere else, and I would spend the rest of my life doing my best to be worthy of you, if you would have me." She was across the room in 3 steps, and she took his face in her hands the way she had imagined doing, with that honesty and directness that was her nature. And she said, "Yes, Hugh Brooks, I will marry you," and kissed him before he could say another word. And he dropped his hat on the schoolroom floor and caught her by the waist and kissed her back with a thoroughness that said everything he had not found words for yet. They were married in June, at the church in Dry Creek, on a morning of pure golden light that felt like the territory had decided to do its best. Margaret wore a dress of ivory cotton with blue ribbon at the collar, and she had bought it from a dressmaker in Cheyenne on a special trip in May, and it fit her perfectly. Hugh wore a dark coat that she had not seen before, freshly pressed, and he had cut his hair and shaved his jaw clean, and he stood at the altar looking at her with an expression of such transparent happiness that she heard me, in the third pew, let out a small sigh. Reverend Sutton performed the ceremony with great warmth, and the 14 students of Dry Creek School attended in their best clothes, most of which had been pressed for the occasion by their mothers, and were beginning to show the strain by the time they sat down. Mrs. Holloway cried. Mr. Holloway shook Hugh's hand so vigorously that Hugh rubbed his knuckles afterward, grinning. Me had made 2 pies and brought them to the reception in the church hall, and Tomas Morales had decorated the table with wildflowers he had gathered that morning, and arranged in a tin cup with a concentration and artistry that moved Margaret nearly to tears. She and Hugh danced one dance after the meal, because there was a fiddle player, old Jim Garber from the feed store, who turned out to have an unexpected gift. And the dance was slow and close, and Hugh was not a natural dancer, but he was steady and present, and he held her as if she were something real and permanent in his. And she rested her cheek against the shoulder of his dark coat, and thought that this was the happiest she had ever been in her entire life. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon that evening, through the long June twilight that turned the sky every shade of rose and gold, and she sat against his side with his arm around her shoulders and watched the mountains go pink in the last of the light. She kept her teaching position. This had been the subject of their one serious disagreement, a conversation in April before the proposal, when he had said something careful about how things were typically done, and she had explained with equal care that she had not traveled from Missouri to a territory schoolhouse to abandon the children who needed her because things were typically done a certain way, and furthermore that she had no intention of becoming a woman who stopped using her mind simply because she had acquired a husband, and that if he felt differently on that subject, then they should clarify it now. He had listened to all of this with his measuring expression, and then he had said, "I would not want you to stop teaching. I think the children need you, and I think you need the work. I only meant I was not sure how you felt about it." She had looked at him. "You should ask then," she said, "instead of saying what is typical." "You are right," he said without defensiveness, and that had been the end of it. She loved him for that, among many other things. The ranch became theirs in the way that spaces become shared, gradually, practically, and with moments of unexpected revelation. She brought her books and put them on the shelf beside his, where they mixed together in a pleasing disorder. She found where the best light fell in the afternoon and moved the small table to catch it. He built her a proper desk, which took him 3 weekends of careful work, and when he was done, it was the most beautiful piece of furniture in the room, and she ran her hands over the smooth wood and looked at him with an expression that made him clear his throat and look at the ceiling. She learned things she had not known she could learn, the names of the cattle, which of them were reliable and which were prone to trouble, how to predict weather from the look of the sky, which of the neighbors were trustworthy and which were not. The Harmon family 2 miles east had a daughter named Clara who was 17 and desperate to learn more than her schooling had given her, and Margaret began lending her books on Saturday afternoons when Clara could come by, which Clara did with a dedication that made Margaret's heart glad. The neighbors were various and interesting. The territory was full of people who had come from everywhere, and the ranching community around Dry Creek contained, within the space of 20 miles, people who had come from Ireland and Germany and Mexico, and the American South, and the American East, all of them working the same difficult land with the same mixture of stubbornness and hope. There were also the people who had been here before all of them, the Shoshone and Arapaho, whose presence and whose displacement were a fact that Margaret could not ignore, and that most of the settlers around them managed to pretend required no thought. She did not pretend that, and neither, she found, did Hugh, who had a complicated respect for the people of the land that had been shaped by years of living alongside and near to them, and who was careful to maintain honest dealings wherever possible in a landscape where honest dealings were not always the norm. "The injustice of it sits badly with me," she told him one evening. "I know I benefit from the same displacement that I find unconscionable. It is an impossible position." "Most honest positions are," he said, "but I would rather hold it honestly than pretend it doesn't exist." She reached across and took his hand at the table. "That is exactly what I think," she said. He turned her hand in his and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was a thing he had started doing, and which never failed to undo her in the best possible way. In October she realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for 2 weeks before she said anything, working the arithmetic of her body with the same methodical honesty she applied to everything. She told Hugh on a Sunday morning, sitting at the table with her coffee, in a straightforward sentence that did not bury the information in either drama or apology. He looked at her for a moment, completely still. Then his face went through a series of expressions she had never seen on it before: surprise, and something that was wonder, and then a happiness so complete that it seemed almost to catch him off guard, as if he had not expected to feel it quite so strongly. He crossed the room in 2 steps and took her face in his hands. It was her gesture. She had done it to him first, and he had learned it from her and pressed his forehead to hers. "A child," he said. It was barely a whisper. "A child," she confirmed, and her eyes were bright with it. He kissed her temple and her forehead and then her mouth, and she laughed and leaned into him. An outside copper moved in the corral, and the October wind turned over the dry grass, and the mountains were dark blue in the distance under a sky the color of smoke. The winter of 1882 going into 1883 was hard, as territory winters always were, but they were warm in it. Hugh had stacked enough wood for the stove before the first snow, and the cabin was solid, and Margaret had learned by now where all the drafts were and how to manage them. She taught through November and into December, until the roads were too uncertain for the daily drive, and then she taught correspondence, sending lessons home with the children on Fridays to be worked through over the week. A system she had devised with Mrs. Holloway's help that the school board accepted with the bemused tolerance they applied to most of Margaret's innovations. She and Hugh spent the evenings reading or talking or playing cards. She had taught him a version of whist that she had learned from her father, and he turned out to have a natural talent for cards that he played with an absolute absence of expression that made her laugh every time she noticed it. "You are impossible to read," she told him one evening. "I thought that was a problem," he said, laying down his hand with precise satisfaction. "In cards it is an advantage," she said. "In conversation it is less so." He looked at her across the table. "You manage," he said. "I have learned to watch your hands," she said. "You give yourself away when you turn your cup." He looked at his hands and then back at her with an expression that was mostly amusement and a little bit of something that looked like admiration. "I will have to be more careful," he said. "Please do not," she said. "I like knowing." He reached across the table and touched her cheek, the backs of his fingers against her face, very gently. And she turned her face into his hand for a moment the way she always did, and he watched her do it with the expression she loved best on him, the one that was simply and entirely present, entirely with her, without reservation or distance. Their son was born in April of 1883, delivered by the doctor who rode out from Dry Creek in a cold spring rain, and he arrived into the world with a great deal of energy and announcement. And Margaret held him in the light of the lamp and looked at his red, furious, perfect face, and felt her heart divide and double in the way that was. She understood now what love did when it had room to grow. Hugh sat beside her on the edge of the bed with his shoulder against hers, and looked at their son, and was, for a long time, entirely without words, which was unusual enough that Margaret looked at him and found his eyes bright with something she had never seen there before. She put the baby in his arms. His hands, which were steady with a blade and a fence post and a horse's bridle, went careful and deliberate around the small wrapped weight of his son, and he held him with the exact concentration of someone who understood they were holding the most valuable thing in the world and did not intend to drop it. "What do we call him?" Margaret asked. Hugh looked at the baby. "Robert," he said without hesitation. "For your father." She had not expected that. She felt the tears come before she could stop them, warm and uncomplicated, the good kind. "Robert Brooks," she said. "Robert Hugh Brooks," said Hugh quietly, still looking at his son. "If you like." "I like it very much," she said, and leaned her head against his shoulder. Robert Hugh Brooks was a good baby in the sense that all babies are perfect, and also that he slept in reasonable intervals, and did not frighten either of his parents more than occasionally. He had Hugh's coloring, dark hair and gray-green eyes that became more definitely gray-green as the weeks passed, and he had Margaret's particular expression of considered attention, the look of someone who was working out what was happening and would have opinions about it shortly. Margaret went back to teaching in September, when Robert was 5 months old, and Clara Harmon, who had spent the summer learning everything Margaret could teach her, and who had proven to be genuinely gifted with children, came to help 3 afternoons a week. It was a practical arrangement that suited everyone, including Robert, who seemed to find the company of Clara entirely satisfactory. Hugh had expanded the cattle operation that spring, adding 20 head with the help of a man named Webb who ran a ranch 20 miles north and wanted a reliable partner for the season. It had been a good risk, well managed, and by fall the ranch was on more secure financial footing than it had been since Hugh had bought it. He came home that October evening with the accounts settled and found Margaret at the table with Robert in her lap, reading aloud to him from a Shakespeare history, Henry V, specifically, which she had removed from the shelf with the particular satisfaction of someone closing a circle. He stood in the door and watched them. Robert had his small hand wrapped around Margaret's finger and was examining the book with the expression of a very serious scholar. "He is 5 months old," Hugh said. "He is never too young for a good story," said Margaret without looking up. Hugh came in and sat in the other chair and listened to her read, and Robert fell asleep between 2 sentences with the abrupt completeness of infants, and the lamplight was warm and the stove was steady, and outside the October wind was doing its thing over the dark prairie. "Good year," Hugh said when she had closed the book. She looked at him across the sleeping baby. "Very good year," she said. The years that followed had the texture of real life, varied, and sometimes difficult and full of work, but also full of the specific joy of a life that was genuinely and completely theirs. There were hard winters and dry summers and seasons when the cattle did poorly, and the worry was real and kept both of them awake longer than they wanted to be. There was the spring of 1885, when a dispute between ranchers over water rights became heated enough that Hugh spent 3 weeks helping the county resolve it before it became something worse, and Margaret spent those 3 weeks with an eye on the horizon waiting for him to come home each evening, and when he did she said nothing about the worry but held him a little longer than usual at the door. He noticed, because he always noticed, and he held her back. The school grew. By 1885 there were 22 children in it, too many for one room, and Margaret spent most of that autumn petitioning the town council for the funding to add a second room, appearing at every council meeting with documents and arguments, and the precise, patient determination that had gotten her across Missouri and into a stranger's cabin in a snowstorm, and across the distance between 2 people who needed each other. The council approved the expansion in December, and she came home and told Hugh, and he lifted her off the ground and spun her once, which he did not do often because it was not his nature, but when he did it meant something real. Clara Harmon became the second teacher when the room was finished, which Margaret had planned all along and which Clara had suspected was coming and had been preparing for with everything she had. Clara was 20 by then and had developed into an extraordinary young teacher, and Margaret felt about her instruction the same thing she supposed a master craftsman felt about a well-taught apprentice, a satisfaction that was entirely unselfish because the work was bigger than any one person doing it. Their daughter was born in the summer of 1886, a July morning so warm that the cabin needed both windows open, and she arrived with a degree of calm that was the precise opposite of Robert's entrance into the world. She simply appeared and lay there looking at everything with the wide, considering gaze of someone who had already decided to be interested in the world. "She looks like you," Hugh said from his place at the edge of the bed, watching her with the same complete attention he had given Robert 3 years before. "She looks like herself," Margaret said. "I hope." "Both can be true," he said. They named her Eleanor. Eleanor May Brooks, May being Margaret's mother's name, her mother who had died when Margaret was 11, and who she still thought of with a love that had no edges. Robert, at 3 years old, inspected his sister with the gravity of a young man who understood that something significant had happened and was working out how to feel about it. He put one careful finger against Eleanor's palm, and she wrapped her small hand around it with the firm grip that newborns had, and Robert looked up at his parents with an expression of complete surprise. "She grabbed me," he said. "She knows you," said Margaret. Robert considered this. Then he sat down on the floor next to the bed and announced that he would stay there, which he did for the better part of an hour before sleep claimed him, and they found him there, curled at the foot of the bed with his cheek on his arm, when the evening lamp was lit. Hugh carried him to his cot without waking him and came back and sat beside Margaret in the lamplight, and she was nursing Eleanor, and the cabin was full of the particular piece of a house that contains everything that matters. "Do you ever think about Missouri?" he asked. She looked at him. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "I think about my father, I think about the river, but I do not wish to be there." "I am glad," he said. I am glad you are here." "So am I," she said, "more than I can properly say." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, slowly and with great gentleness, and she leaned into his hand the way she always did, and Eleanor kept her eyes open and seemed to regard all of this with approval. The years that marked Dry Creek as a growing place brought both good things and complications. More settlers came west through the late 1880s, and the territory was moving steadily toward statehood. Wyoming would enter the Union in 1890, which was a fact that everyone in Dry Creek discussed with strong opinions, though the opinions varied considerably based on what a person thought statehood meant for their particular circumstances. Margaret had her own opinions about it, which she expressed in letters to the territorial papers under her own name, which raised some eyebrows among the more traditional members of the community and generated exactly no surprise whatsoever among those who knew her. Hugh read one of her published letters over supper one evening, a response to an editorial that had suggested women's role in the new state should be carefully circumscribed, and when he finished reading he put the paper down and looked at her and said, "Every word of this is correct." She had been watching his face while he read. "I did not pull any punches," she said. "I noticed," he said. He was smiling. "I would not expect you to." Wyoming entered the Union in July of 1890, and it did so as the first state in the nation to grant women full voting rights, a fact that Margaret discussed with her students at length and that she wrote about with a joy that had warmth and weight to it, because she had spent years watching the injustice of exclusion, and she understood exactly what the change meant. Not everything, not nearly enough, but something real and lasting. A door opened in a wall. Robert was 7 by then and asking complicated questions about everything, which Margaret answered with the same straightforwardness she applied to all things. Hugh watched their son work through questions about the law and fairness, and why things were the way they were with the quietly astonished pride of a man who understood that his wife had made this child, both of his children, but Robert especially in these years, into a small person who was going to spend the rest of his life asking the right questions. Eleanor was 4 and had opinions about horses. She had, from the age of 2.5, been determined to make Copper's acquaintance on her own terms, approaching the corral fence with a steady seriousness that her father recognized in her immediately. By 4 she was being allowed, under strict supervision, to sit on Copper's broad back while Hugh led him in slow circles, and her expression in those moments was one of complete satisfaction. Copper, who was getting old now, bore her with the patience of a horse who had seen things and was prepared to be gentle. The school in Dry Creek had, by 1891, 3 teachers and 43 students. Margaret served as the head teacher and had over the years developed a curriculum that was both rigorous and practical, that included reading and writing and arithmetic alongside natural science and history, and controversially, civics, the rights and responsibilities of people in a society, including people who had only recently been formally granted those rights, and people who had been denied them far too long. She did not fight every battle. She was practical. But she chose the ones that mattered, and she fought those with everything she had. And the community of Dry Creek, which had been wary of this composed, direct woman who had arrived in a broken stagecoach and installed herself as their teacher, had slowly and then entirely come around to her. Me said, at a church gathering in the fall of 1891, that Margaret Brooks was the best thing that had happened to Dry Creek since running water, which was me's highest form of praise and caused general laughter and complete agreement. Hugh, standing beside Margaret when me said this, put his hand on the small of her back in that particular way. He had a quiet, proprietary warmth that was entirely personal between them, the gesture of a man who was proud and knew it, and was not inclined to be restrained about it. She leaned into him for just a moment, just enough. The cabin had been added to twice by 1892, a second room when Robert arrived, and a proper lean-to kitchen when Eleanor came. The original room was still there, with the stove and the table with 2 chairs that had become 3 and then 4, and the bookshelves that now covered most of one wall, their books hopelessly intermingled in the way that pleased her most. The single bed of that first night had been replaced with a proper frame, built by Hugh in 1883 with the same care he had given the desk, and it was wide and solid, and had served them faithfully through a decade of winters. One evening in the late fall of 1892, when the children were asleep and the stove was warm and the lamplight was good, Margaret sat at the desk Hugh had built her and looked at the room around her, at the shelves of books, at the 2 chairs, at the pegs near the door where his coat and her coat hung side by side, at the window with the new glass in the original frame, repaired so many times now that the frame was mostly new wood but the same window. Hugh came in from outside, where he had been checking on the animals in the first frost of the season, and hung his coat on its peg and stood looking at her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She smiled. He asked her this regularly, which she had come to understand was his version of the thing other men expressed with empty words. It was the truest form of interest, the question itself. "I was thinking about that first night," she said. "When you told me there was only 1 room and 1 bed." He came and sat across from her at the table in his chair in the lamplight. "I expected you to turn around and walk back out," he said. "Most women would have." "I am not most women," she said. "No," he said, "you are not." She looked at him across the table, this man she had chosen and who had chosen her, in small repeated ways over 10 years, who had built her a desk and named their son for her father and read Henry V, and held her hand at a fence post in the April sunshine and proposed in a schoolroom without a single dramatic gesture and been honest with her at every turn. "Hugh," she said. "Margaret," he said. "I love you," she said. "I do not say it enough." He looked at her in the lamplight with those gray-green eyes that she knew better than anything in the world, with the expression that was only ever hers, that open, certain, complete expression that he gave to nothing and no one else. "You say it exactly as often as you mean it," he said. "That is the right amount." She reached across the table, and he took her hand, and they sat like that in the warm room while the frost settled over the prairie outside, and the horses moved in the corral and their children slept in the next room. And the books on the wall held all the words of all the people who had ever tried to say what this was, and none of those words were adequate, and none were needed. Robert Brooks, at 9 years old, had developed 3 passionate interests: horses, mathematics, and the question of where the river went. He spent the summers leading his sister on explorations of the creek that ran a mile east of the ranch, bringing home rocks and feathers and small creatures that required identification. And Margaret taught him the names of everything with the enthusiasm of someone who had always believed that naming the world was the first step toward understanding it. Eleanor, at 6, had decided she wanted to learn to read faster than she was being taught, and applied herself to this goal with a determination that was entirely her father's and a methodology that was entirely her mother's. And by the end of the school year, she was reading at a level that placed her comfortably among children 3 years her senior. Her teacher, who was Clara Harmon, now Clara Downing, married to a farmer 2 miles north and teaching still, because Clara had Margaret's conviction that the work was bigger than any single arrangement of one's private life, sent home a note that said Eleanor Brooks was a joy, and a challenge and entirely too perceptive for a 6-year-old, which was the most Clara-like sentence Margaret had ever read, and which she showed to Hugh with considerable satisfaction. Hugh read it and handed it back. "She gets the perceptive from you," he said. "She gets the stubbornness from you," Margaret replied. "That is fair," he said, without argument. The winter of 1892 was the coldest in years. The kind of cold that got into the walls of buildings and made the ground iron hard and turned the world to a single unbroken sheet of white and silver. Hugh spent most of January keeping the cattle alive and the water from freezing and the cabin warm, and Margaret kept the children occupied with lessons and stories and the endless creativity of a woman who had been a teacher for 10 years and knew that the best defense against a cabin-bound winter was a well-engaged mind. She told them stories in the evenings, not just the stories in the books, but stories she made up, long continuing stories about explorers and travelers and people who found themselves in unexpected places and discovered unexpected things. She had been telling these stories since Robert was old enough to listen, and Eleanor had inherited his appetite for them. Hugh listened too. He sat with his mending or his accounts or simply with his hands quiet in his lap and listened to Margaret tell stories, and sometimes she caught him watching her with the expression she had named, early in their marriage, his particular expression, the one that meant she had done something that confirmed something he already knew about her and that he found precious. She always pretended she hadn't noticed and kept telling the story, but she felt it settle over her warmly every time. Copper died that February. He was old, they were not entirely sure how old, as Hugh had bought him from a man who had bought him from someone else, but the veterinarian in Dry Creek had said on his last visit that the horse had lived a full life and then some. He went peacefully, which was the best you could ask for anything, lying down in the stable one morning and not rising, and Hugh found him at first light. Eleanor did not see it happen, but she understood what had happened, and she cried in the particular silent way that was her way of grieving, pressing her face into her father's shoulder while he sat on the edge of her cot and held her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and he was not the kind of man to fill grief with empty words. Robert asked at supper where Copper was now. Hugh and Margaret looked at each other across the table. "Some people believe he is somewhere peaceful," Margaret said carefully. "Green grass and cool water. Do you believe that?" Robert asked her directly because he was Robert and he always asked directly. "I believe that the kindness of a good animal lives in the people it knew," she said. I believe Copper lives in your father who took care of him, and in your sister who loved him, and in you who fed him apples through the fence rail since you were old enough to hold one." Robert considered this with his mathematician's expression. "That is a good answer," he said. Hugh reached under the table and found her hand and held it. By 1894, things had settled into the deep, rhythmic goodness of a life fully built. The ranch was doing well. The school was doing well. The children were 8 and 11 years old now, and increasingly their own people. Robert with his serious mind and his father's stillness and his mother's directness. Eleanor with her horse sense and her perceptive eye, and the particular combination of her parents' best qualities that seemed designed to make both of them slightly awed by her. Margaret had started writing. Not letters to papers, though she continued those, but longer pieces, essays about frontier education, about the experience of women building lives in the territory, about the history that was being made here and the history that had preceded them both. She wrote in the evenings at her desk by lamplight, and Hugh read everything she wrote with the same complete attention he gave to all things that mattered, and his comments were always the right kind, honest without being unkind, pointing toward the places where a thing could be better without diminishing the places where it was already good. She sent one essay to a journal in Chicago in the fall of 1894, and it was published in January of 1895, and she held the journal in her hands with an expression that Hugh described privately to himself as the look she had when something she had worked for had become real. "Your name in print," he said, looking over her shoulder at the page. "Margaret Brooks," she read. "Educator, Wyoming Territory." "Wyoming State," he corrected gently. She had been a territory teacher and a state teacher both. She laughed. "Wyoming State," she agreed. She wrote more essays and some were published and some were not, and she kept writing either way. She told Hugh once that the ones that were not published were often her favorites, because they were the ones where she had gone somewhere she was not sure a journal would follow her, and he said that sounded exactly right. In the spring of 1895, there was a morning that Margaret carried with her for the rest of her life as one of the complete things. One of the moments where all the pieces of a life come together and hold still long enough to be seen whole. It was early May, and the prairie was in its green season, and the morning air was that particular blend of cold and warm that meant spring had arrived and intended to stay. Margaret came outside with 2 cups of coffee and found Hugh at the corral fence copper gone now 2 years, replaced by a younger bay that Eleanor had named Justice, with the decisive naming of a child who had been given a rich vocabulary, watching the morning come up over the mountains. She handed him a cup. He took it without looking, because he knew her step. Robert and Eleanor were visible at the far edge of the property, investigating something near the creek. Their voices floated back, clear in the morning air, and their laughter, which had always been among the finest sounds the world produced. "Hugh," she said. He said. "I want you to know something," she said. He turned from the mountains and looked at her with the expression that was hers. "I want you to know that the night I walked in through your gate, the night the wheel broke on the stagecoach, and you told me there was only one room and one bed, I had no idea. I had no idea at all." He was quiet, listening with that completeness of attention that had always been his gift to her. "I thought I was just finding shelter for the night," she said. "I thought I was being practical. I thought I was being the person who doesn't make things difficult, who sleeps in worse and keeps going." She paused. "I had no idea that I was walking into my life." He looked at her for a moment. His gray-green eyes in the morning light were deep and warm and full of all the years they had made together, all the mornings and evenings and hard winters and good summers, all the arguments fairly had and fairly resolved, all the books on the shelf, all the children by the creek, all of it. "I knew," he said quietly. She looked at him. "When?" He thought about it. "When you walked through the gate," he said. "You came through it the way you come through everything, like you had already decided it was worth doing and were not going to be talked out of it." He looked down at his cup and then back at her. "I thought, if she stays, If she stays the night, something is going to change. And I was right. She took a step toward him, and he opened his arm, and she went into his side, and he closed it around her, and they stood at the fence while the morning built itself over the mountains, and the children's voices came to them across the spring grass. Something changed, she agreed. He pressed his lips to the top of her head and held them there for a moment. Margaret, he said quietly, in the way he sometimes said her name alone, like a sentence that contained everything. Hugh, she said back. Same way, same weight. The children came running back across the grass with a discovery, Robert holding something carefully in his cupped hands that turned out to be a small stone, smooth and translucent, that caught the morning light and threw it back in small pieces. Eleanor was already explaining what kind of stone it was with a confidence that exceeded her geological knowledge, but not her enthusiasm. And Robert was listening with the patience of an older brother who had learned to find his sister's certainty charming. They came to the fence, and Robert opened his hands to show them, and the stone lay there in the morning light, small and ordinary and wonderful. Margaret looked at the stone, and then at her children, and then at the mountains, and then at Hugh, who was looking at her with the slight, specific smile that was his best one, the one that reached his eyes. She had slept in worse than one room and one bed. She had walked through that gate. Everything since had been the consequence of that one honest, practical, brave decision, and every consequence had been a blessing. And she had loved it all, the hard parts and the good parts and the ordinary parts and the extraordinary ones, loved it with the full honesty that was her nature, and been loved back the same way, which was the only way that love worth having actually worked. She reached out and took the small glowing stone from Robert's hands and held it up to the morning light. It caught the sun, and she turned it, and the light moved through it and scattered. "It is beautiful," she said. "I found it in the creek," Robert said seriously. "The water has been working on it a long time." She smiled and handed it back. "That is how the best things are made," she said. Hugh's hand found hers at her side, and she laced her fingers through his, and they stood together in the May morning with their children and their land and their years, and the mountains were clear and close in the clean air, and the day was still ahead of them, and it was good. It was genuinely and completely and finally good, in the way of things that have been built slowly and honestly from the right materials, with the right person, with nothing held back. The stone glittered in Robert's hand. Eleanor was already talking about the next thing. The horses moved in the corral. The smoke rose from the chimney of the cabin, thin and white and straight up into the blue spring sky. And that was enough. That was exactly, precisely, wholly enough.